Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's office hours, How to Embed Equity in Collective Impact Initiatives. I'm Jennifer Splansky-Jester, Executive Director of the Collective Impact Forum, and we're delighted to have you with us today. Thanks so much. And for those of you who have been on some of the office hours the past few weeks, thanks for joining us again. Before we go any further, I would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous land that we're all joining from. Although we are meeting virtually, we believe that it's important to acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from Indigenous territory. And we honor and respect the diverse Indigenous peoples still connected to this land on which we reside. The Collective Impact Forum team would like to acknowledge that the session is being presented and recorded on the traditional land of the Piscataway, Anacostan, Ohlone, Coast Salish, Suquamish, and Duwamish people, past and present. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the people of these Indigenous communities. Thank you. We also would love to give you all an opportunity to let us know the Indigenous lands that you're on today. So you can open up the chat. And if you're not sure whose land you're on, and you're based in the US or Canada, you can actually look that up. So we'll give you a minute to do that. You can go to native-land.ca, or you can text your city and state to the number on the screen here. And thank you to Code for Anchorage for creating this open source project and resource for us all. So I see someone else from Coast Salish land, the Muckleshoot land. Many coming in. Wonderful. Thank you. You all have this information at your fingertips. That's terrific. Well, I am going to, we'll continue to keep an eye on the chat, and thank you all for sharing. I'm going to just do a few more logistics before handing it over to Sheri and Junious. So today is an office hour session. So the way we're going to run it is we have about 60 minutes, and Sheri and Junious are going to present just a very few slides up front and then spend most of our time in Q&A mode. Because this is a Zoom webinar, there's actually a Q&A box in addition to the chat box. And we ask you please to submit your questions in the Q&A specific section in your little Zoom toolbar. That will help us track the questions separately from the chat, and we'll make sure we see the questions to be able to send them over to Junious and Sheri, and we'll get through as many as possible in the time we have. Two more notes: we will be able to share the slides in case you're interested in seeing them later, and we'll also send around a link to the recording in case you'd like to go back to it or share it with others in your network. So last housekeeping point, we have turned on live captioning to increase accessibility of today's session. If that is challenging for you, if that's distracting, you can actually turn that off on your side by going to the live transcript option at the bottom and turning off the subtitle option. So with that, I am going to come over here, and yes, Sheri and Junious, you are on the screen. Wonderful. So let me just do a quick introduction before handing it over. I'm thrilled to have Sheri Brady and Junious Williams joining today. Sheri serves as the Director of Strategic Partnerships at the Aspen Institute's Forum for Community Solutions, as well as the co-lead of the Collective Impact Forum, which is hosted by the Aspen Institute and FSG. Junious Williams serves as Senior Advisor to the Collective Impact Forum and is Principal of Junious Williams Consulting. Prior to this, he served as President and CEO of Urban Strategies Council. So I'm delighted to have Sheri and Junious joining me today, and I will hand it over to you all.
Great, thanks, Jen. Glad to be here. Thank you for joining us. We're gonna jump pretty much right into it. I'm just gonna say a bit of an opening thing and then let Junious as well. As Jen said, I'm Sheri Brady, the Aspen Institute Forum for Community Solutions. As this is an opening comment, one of the things I really wanted to say is we often hear people say things like, we don't know where to start, we're not experts at this, we can't really jump into talking about equity, what does that mean? And I would say my opening tip for you, and we'll talk more and answer questions as we're going along, would really be that there needs to be a level setting when you are going to sort of do this kind of work within the organization, within the collective that you're working on. And it really means sort of building a common language that everyone is talking to when you're talking about these issues. Because I find that we use terms equity, inclusion, diversity, othering and belonging, all these terms sort of like often mean the same things to people. They're talking about them and people can be talking at different purposes about the work that they're trying to do. Equity does not equal equality, those kinds of things. And so really, I would say a starting point is to develop a common language for the collective, for the organization, so that everyone is talking about the same things and trying to get to the same goals of the work. And that's just sort of my opening tip as we go forward. Junious?
Yeah, thank you, Sheri. And I want to start by thanking Jennifer and Tracy for helping to organize today. And I would just add to Sheri's comment the notion that this is really hard because as you know from the work you're already doing on collective impact, you've got a problem you're trying to solve and you're organizing yourself and your partners to try to attack that problem. You're also trying to build a collaborative infrastructure, a new culture and way of problem solving across sectors and across stakeholder groups. And on top of that, you have something that may be of more enormity than either of those, which is dealing with the historical patterns of discrimination and mistreatment of people that we have to correct through processes of equity in order to address the underlying problem. So it goes a step beyond the old metaphor of trying to build the plane and fly it. And I don't even know how you add that other dimension, except to say it's really hard and tough work to keep all of these things moving simultaneously and reaching the sort of synergies that need to happen between those three areas of activity. So hopefully some of what we can share with you today will be helpful in helping you to navigate this very difficult terrain.
So we just have a couple slides we wanted to share before we jump on questions. And the first is sort of, as you're thinking about building equity into your policies and practices, you really need to think about it in sort of these four levels and in these four spaces in the work to get to the population level change that you're usually seeking with a collective impact effort. Interventions and sort of really thinking about to what extent you're going to intervene in how that's going to be focused on equity and decreasing disparities within the work that you're doing. Also thinking about it in your collaborative and sort of what extent are you modeling the practices and the commitment to equity in your leadership, in your membership, in your engagement, also in your data, in your interventions and outcomes. Sort of, are you asking those questions at each point? Are we disaggregating data? Are we making sure that we have the right folks around the table? Those kinds of questions. Backbone organization also needs to be thinking about to what extent it is modeling and practicing these behaviors within their work, in their leadership, within the staff composition, and also in how they're dealing with their policies and practices as an organization and as the backbone and support for the collective. And with partners organizations, always be asking yourselves who's around the table, are the people that we need around the table, who's missing, and how are they also embedding equity into their practices as they're thinking about the outcomes to get to the initiative and in the other work that they're doing, and sort of that they're all believing in the importance of having an equity focus in the work. And so those are sort of four places that you really need to be thinking about and asking these questions as you're doing this work. Next slide.
Yeah, this is a relatively new slide, and I developed it as I interacted with people around trying to get them to understand that it was really important that adopting an equity lens is a really important first step because it starts you interacting with the issues and problems and opportunities associated with addressing equity. But unfortunately, too many people stay there. And simply to look at things through an equity lens, to discover that there are disparities and inequities and opportunities and outcomes for different subpopulations, and to do nothing about it is almost, is in fact a waste of time. So the equity and lens is really important. And that starts with data. You have to get on top of understanding who are our people, what are the subgroups and subpopulations, and that's adopting this equity lens early on, where you're disaggregating data and trying to understand what exactly is happening in your community and is happening to different subgroups within the population. Another level of intervention or action that one can take around the equity issues or concerns is adopting equity as a principle and value. Many of us in our process of organizing our collective impact initiatives have adopted various values to sort of guide the work. What are our values and principles, where when we get to tough decisions, we can look to those to help us resolve those. So one thing that you can do is adopt a very strong equity platform and commitment as a principle or value that's going to guide your work. There's also the opportunity to think about equity as either a strategy in and of itself or as an element of every strategy that gets adopted, to sort of start embedding it in the thinking and the way that we approach the work. At the next level, though, there are interventions and working on equity through policy mechanisms, where you're adopting various policies and procedures and practices which require that equity as a foundation for the work that you're doing. The next sort of level of intervention is really embedding equity as an outcome for every element of its work. And sometimes the need is to adopt equity, if you've adopted equity as a particular strategy, to make sure that you're explicit about equity as an outcome that is measurable and paid attention to in the work. The final sort of stage, and I've only seen a couple of organizations that have really gone this far, but it's also it's also possible to adopt equity as the North Star for the work of the organization that is central to it achieving its mission. And I argue for that because we're not going to repair the harm that's been done to people of color, to women, to LGBTQ people, to any subpopulation that has experienced the effects of discrimination. We're not going to rid that until we adopt equity as central to our mission, that we cannot accomplish what we want to without accomplishing and addressing equity. So this is just a frame to think about. And I think both Sheri and I, in the slides that we've introduced, is to say to people, you've got to situate your work. You can just see from these two slides the enormity of activities that could happen related to equity. And quite frankly, it's hard to deal at all of these levels. So I think we start with the notion that you got to situate the work. At what level is it most important? Is it interventions? Is it getting the collaborative right, where you're going to really emphasize equity? In terms of interventions, where are you willing to go? And I'll end on that. There's also a practical issue here that in many circumstances, people are unwilling or unable to go beyond just kind of the data lens of equity because of the political and ideological issues that they're going to run into in their community. But you need to situate and figure out where the work is and pursue it vigorously to the extent that you can within the context that you exist.
Sheri and Junious, thank you for the opening slides and the framing. We have lots of really great questions coming in. Just one to start with, we often hear the term equity lens, and I'm not sure we really know what it means. Can you be more specific what you mean when you say an equity lens?
So I guess I'll start. And I think, so what I'm thinking about when I say an equity lens is really that you're constantly asking the questions, who are the different populations that we work with? Are they all receiving sort of the same benefit of the service, or are they being included as a part of the solutions that are coming up in the work sort of on a regular basis? That means, you know, as Junious says in that first sort of circle there, the data piece, right? Are you asking these questions as you're looking at your data and what the work is telling you, how you're being successful or not being successful, right? It could be that overall you're being successful in community, but those who are most impacted by it, those people of color, women, people in the LGBTQ community who might be also experiencing these problems, are not receiving the same benefit of the work that's happening. And so I think for me, that's what I think it's is asking that equity lens. It's also asking yourselves, if we have, you know, sort of, if we have people at the table who are representative of those who are closest to the problems, who are going to be, who we need to be working with in the community. And some of that, sometimes a representation model, if we have this percentage of people in the population, we have this percentage of people involved in sort of the leadership piece and that kind of thing, and asking those questions. So when I say an equity lens, it's sort of asking to make sure that you're reaching everyone that is supposed to be benefiting from your services, if they're receiving what they need from the services or from the intervention, whatever that might be. Junious might have a different take on that.
No, I think that's very consistent with how I think about it.
Jen, you're on mute, hon.
Thank you. Someone asks here, you know, this is super critical to moving our work forward, and it feels like there are an overwhelming volume of considerations. As the backbone leader, the only full-time staff charged with leading our work, and they say in this case they're 3 years in, where do we start? Where might you recommend that we start being more intentional about centering equity in our work?
Boy, that's difficult because it is relatively easier if it's embedded from the beginning. If you've gone down the road already and it hasn't been a concern, it makes it much more difficult. I think that where I would suggest that people who are in that position start is that you should be either in a formative or a developmental sense, or you may be to a summative sense where you're evaluating kind of how well things are going, both in the collaborative itself and with respect to the interventions that you're deploying to try to attack the problem. And I think that where I would try to get people to start is looking at your data. Okay, we've done, you know, like a tutorial program as a part of our grade level reading where we're matching kids with adults to see if that helps to increase their reading skills. So I would want you to analyze, okay, how well has that worked with different subpopulations that we have employed that particular intervention with, to see how well it's working. So you see where I'm going. I think that in your process of sort of doing performance evaluation on your interventions to figure out how well things are working, that's a place where you might want to interject the notion of, well, how well are we doing with different subpopulations? Is anybody or any subgroup experiencing disparities as an entry point? There have been very few circumstances and issues, at least that I've worked on, where that sort of analysis doesn't yield a result of, oh my goodness, X group or Y group seem not to have enrolled at the proportion that they represent in the population, or they don't seem to be having outcomes that are comparable to other subgroups. But that's a way to enter in to the conversation if it hasn't been embedded, is to look at how our interventions affecting different subpopulations as a way to get in. Should we be doing something to make sure that they are being equitably, the opportunities are being equitably distributed, and that the outcomes are equitable?
Thank you, Junious. So many good questions. So someone asks, how can we, here, give me a minute. How can institutional or organized philanthropy, recognizing its own privilege, support equity interventions in its grant making or inside its own institution? And then another sort of related question was, as a funder, if you have any advice for funders around centering equity in their practices, are there ways that it's helpful for them to change their reporting requirements of organizations so that they're not so labor intensive, especially for small POC-led organizations? So maybe some general reflections on the role of philanthropy based on some of the specifics of those questions.
So I'll start. Yeah, I think we've seen examples in, our COVID-19 world where foundations and philanthropies have lessened requirements for getting money out the door quickly to meet the needs of people who are suffering from issues. And they've asked for less information to get the money out the door. They've asked for less reporting on the other side. They've said, oh, I know we gave you a grant to do this, but if you need to do something else with it based on sort of the needs of your community, do that. They could do that in sort of an emergency situation. I'm not sure why those practices can't continue once we sort of are on the other side of this. And so I think the world didn't stop. They were still able to get money out the door. Good work was still being done. I think the reality is that philanthropy needs to think about what information we actually need from grantees to do the work, right? I get that. And also, and it needs to be and weigh it against how much you're actually giving them. I mean, I've had grant reports. I'm like, this is $10,000 to support an event. We need 15 reports from you. Why? Like, you gave me $10,000. Not that we didn't appreciate the $10,000, but I feel like it is, thinking about what you actually need to get from people to assure that your money is doing good work, which I understand folks want, but it's also, how do you do your due diligence? Do you support your grantees? Are you funding this organization because you believe in the work they're doing? And think about those things as a sector. And when you think about why we actually need all of the information we ask for from organizations when we want to give them money, recognizing that that's a power play in a lot of cases. And so organizations often then spend more time being responsive to funders' data input and paperwork needs than doing the actual work that needs to happen. So I think as a sector, we need to really think about what we actually need to make sure that we're doing due diligence, that we're making sure that the money is being well spent, if that's what the concern is, and we're learning about the work that's being done. And how do we also think about how grantees are doing what they're doing for other reports that they have to do, and accepting that? Do they do annual reports if they're an organization? Is that okay to take that? So you're learning and understanding what the organization is doing. So I think there's a sector we need to think about what actual information we actually need to know that the money is doing good work, and focus on that. That's sort of an overarching piece of that that I would say needs to be thought about.
Yeah, I want to add a couple points. I think that as is happening with a number of businesses and a number of organizations, I think that where philanthropy needs to start is for foundations and corporations, if it's through their philanthropic arms, to begin by knowing their own history and their own contribution to the current circumstances. I was really impressed by the recent announcement of Jesuits around their $100 million reparations. That came in part from stopping and looking at the current situation and their own history as an organization to find out that they contributed significantly to the current status of Black people in the area, well, all over actually, but certainly in that particular diocese. So understanding one's own contribution and responsibility, and whether or not there are some reparations in order, given the behavior and conduct of that foundation. I think secondly, it's really important to look at the data. We have a tendency in progressive organizations to pretend we're colorblind. And since we don't overtly practice racist conduct, that somehow it absolves us from responsibility to look introspectively. So the second thing is, how fair have we been as a philanthropic institution, and how we've given out our grants and the other resources that are available. And then finally, and I think Sheri's alluding to this, are there equity standards? Given what we know about small organizations that are sort of the mom and pop or even mid-sized organizations, do we have a system of qualifications, requirements, reporting and stuff that is really equitable? And it's stupid to find a mom and pop operation that's doing really good work and divert them from the good work to do some Byzantine administrivia that some bureaucrat wants to have, versus helping to strengthen that organization to do what they do well. And I think that there is a hesitancy on the part of people in philanthropy, and I'll generalize, of treating people differently. We have got to get over that, because it's a fundamental problem. We have never treated everybody equally. Had we done that from the very outset of this nation, we wouldn't be in this position. And so now we can't interpose this defense that we can't treat people differently. We always have. The issue is, are you willing to treat people differently in an affirmative context to make them whole as a result of the deprivation and discrimination that you subjected them to? And if you can't get out of the mindset, and a really distorted mindset, that everything is about treating people equally, we're never going to dig ourselves out of these problems. And I think philanthropy is in a position to model some of the behaviors around equity that will make other organizations who listen to them and pay attention to them think it's all right to do the same thing.
Amen, Junious. Amen. Claps in the chat. Sheri, I think you were going to mention some,
so
hard to follow that, but some concrete resources to point people to.
So, things that there are sort of tools that folks are developing right now that can help philanthropy think about this. One that I'll call attention to is NCRP's Power Moves. It's really a series of assessments and questions that philanthropy and philanthropic organizations can ask themselves about how they're doing their work, and if it's equitable, excuse me, and how they're thinking about the question of power and what that means for the work that they're doing. So I highly recommend that.
Great. So we have a number of questions related to data, going a little deeper on data and evaluation. And maybe I'll just ask a couple for, you can pick how to respond. So what suggestions do you have for evaluating equity-focused collective impact efforts? And I think, in terms of their work addressing some of the disparities and inequities in their community. And then, again, what metrics are you using to measure your impact? So that's a broad question, but maybe some thoughts on ways to think about measuring. You've spoken a little bit, Junious, already about disaggregating data and looking for, of course, how different populations are experiencing the topic at hand. But if you could say a little bit more about evaluation, that would be appreciated by several folks.
Yeah. Well, for me, I think the major thing is to realize that on most of the problems that we're dealing with, we have sort of dual goals, or we should have dual goals. And let me use my classic example of grade level reading to illustrate that. Our kids in America, as it relates to grade level reading, perform horribly against most of the rest of the industrialized world. Not only do we have the fact that our kids lag behind most of the industrialized world, but when you disaggregate the data and begin to see the patterns by race, ethnicity, gender, and other characteristics, we've got a dual problem that not only are all of our kids not performing well, but kids of color, for example, are even performing at a lower level. And I raise that because part of what we're trying to do, if you're attacking that problem, is to not only have a goal with respect to how you want kids to improve against the standard in your state or against international standards, but how much are we closing the gap between different populations? And that those become, for me, the most important sort of evaluative measures. Are we reducing or eliminating the disparities and outcomes for different subpopulations? And that's the measure I'm most concerned with in terms of measuring equity. I would add one other dimension though, and this is around the issue of probably you want to do some sort of survey work with respect to people in your collaborative regarding how are their views and attitudes related to the equity work that you're focused on changing? I mean, are people more supportive of the work? Do they feel like something is getting accomplished? Because I think you have to, and we may disagree on how one attacks the problem, but you need to know whether or not and how, well, not whether or not, but how attitudes may be changing among people who are working on the problem, because you for this sort of tough work, you need high morale. And if people don't feel like they're making progress, don't feel like they're learning what they need to learn, don't feel like they're kind of moving the needle on this, they're going to disengage from the work. So I think that in addition to that outcome piece that, yeah, we're closing the gap, our people gaining confidence in their ability to work on this issue and their knowledge and understanding of it. So those are a couple things that I would focus on in an evaluative context. But the equity issue to me is largely a numbers issue. I mean, I'm worried about those outcomes and the disparities that various groups are experiencing, and we need to close those. So I've got a built-in measure that started from the data that got me into this work. I'm talking about the collaborative, into the work in the first place, is that we notice disparities for significant proportions of our population.
Thanks, Junious. Let's see. Do you have, shifting gears a little bit, do you have any advice on equity practices in extremely rural areas where internet or transportation issues are compounding already existing inequities?
Yeah, I do. And it requires me to step back a moment because this comes up. In fact, I'm working with a group, and that's a big concern because the county has a lot of rural areas and a couple of urban hubs, and they want the work to be county-wide. I focus much of my work on equity around race and ethnicity, and to a significant extent, gender and LGBTQ issues. But I work mostly in urban environments. But the point I want to make is that while that's the focus in a lot of situations, it's not the exclusive focus. And it goes back to where we started. Who is your population and what are the subgroups? You know the culture of the community, and you may be rural, but you know there's not a monolith. It's not a monolithic population. There are subgroups. They may be, and just to throw out a term, there may be kind of the suburban farmer part of that rural thing as opposed to the real farmers. There may be race and ethnicity. There may be income. There may be occupational. I think what is important is to understand, again, who are our people and what are the subgroups in our people, and running the data. I would argue that there are very few situations I've ever been in that there wasn't an equity issue of some sort. And it might not be race, because you may be monolithic, you know, in the sort of the racial dimensions of the population, but there are dimensions of differences, and that we have probably over time structured into our operation disadvantages for people who are part of those subgroups. So I think it's incumbent upon us to start with the question of who is our population, and who are the subgroups of our population. And when we run the data and disaggregate by those subpopulations, what does it tell us about how equitable the outcomes have been for various subgroups? So I think you can find the issue. It may not be race, but there's probably something there. And let me just quickly add to that, there's a strategic issue. There are places that I work where there are racial issues, but the political dynamics are such that you cannot exclusively focus on race. The type of analysis I'm talking about, to look at who else besides, for example, Black and Latinx folks are experiencing disparities because of race and ethnicity, it is possible to sort of figure out who the other populations are, and to have this broader frame. It's not my preferred method, but it might be politically necessary to do that, to say, well, we're going to deal with race, but we also have issue X or Y where that population. So we're developing a framework where we're going to deal with the disparities as we uncover them. Some are obviously racial, ethnic. There may be gender ones. They may be rural versus urban. What is it? And can you develop a package of approaches that are inclusive of the diversity of that community?
Another question from a rural-oriented participant. So the question is asked, I would love finding data that isn't colorblind. I have had a hard time finding local data that breaks out by race, ethnicity, gender. We're in a rural area that isn't highly populated. Is that why? Is the data too low? So any advice on seeking data sources that enable you to do more disaggregation?
Well, Policy Links, there's a racial equity atlas that Policy Link has started. That's I would say a place to start, and I could look it up, but I really have to be honest, like switching between screens when I'm trying to present will not be good. So hopefully Tracy in the background will help you find that thing to get it.
It's the National Equity Atlas.
Right. And so that's, I think, a place to start. Will help with that. So that's the one thing that comes to mind as I'm thinking about that, because I do think that that's often a response we get from folks is I don't know how, I don't know where, I don't know. And I think that is a huge equity issue. And we talked a little bit about it, I think, at Champions, and the idea that there are communities that are always considered sort of the other or statistically not significant, which is, I think, a real problem at work. I'm thinking of Indigenous communities in particular for this point. And so, yeah, that's a place that I would start.
Yeah, I think the other place that I frequently go to data to get data is the public health department. And whether it's county or city, they typically have fairly good data. And especially if you're in a jurisdiction where they've adopted a social determinants of health framework, you often find that because they're concerned about affordable housing stock and the quality of that stock, because it's a contributor in terms of the social determinants of health framework, that they may be gathering and collecting data on housing quality or affordability of housing. So I think that they are usually a good resource. And as I said, if they're employing a social determinants of health framework, they may have education, economic data, other sort of data beyond health, directly health related data. So.
Great. And some folks were asking for the link to the National Equity Atlas, and it is dropped in the chat in case you didn't notice that. So thank you, Tracy.
The other source is, and I'm not as familiar, is this USA Data website that, who's the, oh, I'm trying to remember the name. USA Data, it's an amazing and developing website. One of the big philanthropists out of the tech industry, Ballmer, I think, funds it, but it's worth looking at. They've got good data on a lot of different issues. The problem is the small area analysis. Sometimes a lot of these don't go any further down than a city level or a county level, but when they do, that might be another source to take a look at of pre-existing data that you can grab.
Super helpful. So here is a question that I'm going to tee up, Sheri. So, so I feel strongly that we should not, we being, so I'll just read it. I feel strongly that we should not identify the problem on behalf of others, but engage those with lived experience to define the problems and then work together to co-create solutions. My MBA or PhD is not any more relevant than those with lived experience, for example, in foster care. Do you agree that you cannot embed equity without including those people in decision-making that are facing the inequity?
Yes, I do agree. It's like that's simple. That's a softball. Thank you. No, I do agree. I believe that Representative Presley, there's a quote that, and I'm going to mangle it, but I'm going to sort of paraphrase that: those who are closest to the pain or should be closest to the solutions. I think it is important that you have those voices as a part of developing and co-creating solutions, because if you're not, you're really not reaching you're basing everything on, while data is important, we also need to think about the type of data, right? So and I think those voices are data. You're not just basing it on numbers, and someone with a PhD, a business degree or whatever has read a statistical package and said, this is the problem. And I know this because I've done this. I think numbers tell us some things, but stories are important there as well. So you have to include those voices as a part of solution development if you really want to reach a community and make sure that it's taking hold in a way that doesn't allow you to just cream the sort of the conversation that we're talking about there, that the people are getting what they need out of the solutions that are coming forward.
Yeah. I want to add to that, because I agree wholeheartedly with what Sheri said, and try to incorporate that into my work. But I would also say this, which is that the lived expertise with the academic expertise, the issue and the challenge is how do you blend them? And what I see far too often is a withdrawal of the sort of academic expertise from the conversation. And it's almost, to me, sometimes even a little on the hinge of disrespectful that everything that comes out of the mouths of anybody who's got lived experience is automatically the gospel. Well, they are a view on it, but it ain't the gospel. And we do best when we're able to blend the knowledge and experience that residents and those with lived experience with the oftentimes broader different academic experience. And when you're able to blend those two, you get the best of those. And that's some of the most difficult work I've ever attempted to do, because you come in with some embedded power imbalances with a societal sort of notion that somehow then people who went to school and their knowledge base is better. I don't think it's better. I think it's different and it's useful along with the residents. And how do you manage and blend that? And I'd say one thing, you've got to inculcate in everybody's mind that everybody's on a learning journey here, that everybody's bringing something to the table, but everybody got something to learn. And so nobody gets comfortable with their current state of knowledge and understanding, and that you've embedded into the process of how we learn to work together, how we learn to honor and understand what people know. There's a whole process that has to happen. And I don't think we're very artful at that. We've got the language now that we need to, have all of the different forms of expertise at the table, but I don't think we figured out how one successfully manages that, because talk about another level of complexity and work to add to the 3 or 4 levels that we've already talked about. So a lot going on, but I think these are critical issues to figure out how to do them well so that you actually get the benefit of the wisdom and knowledge that people with lived experience can bring to the entire process of figuring out and implementing strategies that are going to address problems.
Yeah, and along these lines, folks are asking if you have any examples or processes or frameworks for ways of setting up coalition or collaborative membership that is inclusive and diverse and equitable. So kind of how you're setting the table for who is involved so that it is representing these ranges of perspectives. Do you have any examples that you want to speak to or guidance?
I'm in the midst of one right now that is a unique opportunity. Basically, it's an organization that has made equity its North Star. It's a philanthropic organization. So within the context of them having done that, and also created this notion about the engagement of people with lived experience. So what we decided to do, okay, if we're real about that, everybody that we create, every kind of governing body, decision-making body, is a majority resident. And we're actually implementing that. We're in the early stages of it, but it's a thing to say, okay, that's structurally how we're going to do this, is we're going to have the majority resident. And then secondly, and the leader of the organization is good about this, the money goes with them. So they're going to decide on how not only the framework and the interventions, but they're going to make the decisions about how to deploy the existing resources. So you structurally started doing something that's very different. Majority resident. Oh, they got control of the money as well. So some different sort of things have been put in place in that structure. Now we're scrambling to figure out, well, how does one manage all this? Because it's, for many of us, new territory. But I think that that's the sort of thing that begins to say, we're going to do something different than what we've historically done to capitalize on the knowledge and wisdom that residents bring.
And Sheri and Junious, do you have a perspective on what type of investments or compensation is helpful, required, advised for the for compensating residents for their participation in the collaboration or not?
I would say yes, that you should compensate them. I think that you should be treating the folks that you're that are sort of participating in this just like you're treating the professionals that are participating in this, right? Like, I mean, that you're taking advantage of their knowledge, you're, picking their brains, they're doing all that. It's time, it's important, and you should acknowledge that with compensation. I also think it means thinking about when you hold meetings, when you have meetings, when you ask them to participate, that you provide childcare if that's necessary, that you provide transportation and stipends if that's necessary. If you're asking them to come to you and they might not be able to, they don't have cars or they don't have childcare, so they can't. And thinking about those kinds of things, I think it is important. And I try to, and I think you have to think about how often you are engaging them, right? To think about the stipend or the salary that you're paying them, right? If it's sort of you're doing it a couple times, and what's your sort of plan for this kind of engagement? Or if you're asking them to sort of do this on a regular basis as sort of a secondary job, as sort of a kind of consultant fee, how are you paying your consultants? Build that into your budget to be able to do that. I think it's this idea of saying that you value the knowledge that they have, just as that and the participation that they're having, that you value them, you value that, and that you're supporting, compensating them for giving their time talent and treasure to your process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let me just go on with the example I was already giving you. The way that we resolve that is that, and everybody knows this, is that the rest of everybody else is sitting around the table, and we're all getting paid because we're all salaried workers from the public agencies, the nonprofits, everybody there. So we decided, and then the external consultants, we decided to make the residents, as a part of our planning team, consultants. So they have consulting contracts. They are getting paid an hourly consulting rate, and are developing their skills and their mindset that this is my work. I bring expertise that's valued to the table. So that's what we're doing in that project. And this is the same project I mentioned before, where those residents are the majority of this planning team, for which they're being paid to participate as consultants.
And a very specific question, but how is that getting funded? Philanthropy or other sources?
It's being paid for through a philanthropic grant. Yeah.
Great. So another question here. So there's someone in the process of hiring a staff member who will join the backbone team of the coalition, and they're really hoping they can change the status quo when it comes to the selection process. Do you have recommendations for ways to center equity in a search process for a critical backbone role?
Go ahead, Sheri.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about where I work. I think that it is that you have to think beyond sort of the usual suspects that you send your job notifications to. Are you not sending it to sort of HBCUs potentially? I don't know what level this sort of is. So are you sending it, but they have alumni networks to tribal colleges, to other kinds of organizations that reach out to underrepresented folks in your field. Community spaces, right? Is this something that someone in the community might be good at that might not? And also think about sort of your requirements. I think I've read job descriptions in the past that like basically don't apply unless you have a degree from an Ivy League or, a sort of a top tier school, whatever that might be, and not taking into account other things like experience, that they've already been doing this work in some way, shape, or form, and that what they've learned transfers to this job, even they don't have a, MA from, a business, whatever school it might be. So I think that those are the kinds of questions that you need to be asking yourselves. In sort of, if you're going beyond your sort of usual suspects, your usual reach, are there folks that you work with in the community that might have some thoughts about where this could go? How are you pulling them into that conversation? So those are some of the suggestions that I would make on that.
Yeah, and I want to I think it's difficult that it doesn't sound to me, and I may be presumptuous on this. It sounds to me like you're trying to do it midstream, and that's not a good idea. Where I would counsel you to start is you need to start with an organizational equity assessment. And not to start in the middle of the context, because the possibility is that you're going to bring someone of color in and it's going to fail because your organization ain't ready. The other thing is bringing one person of color in and putting the burden on them around changing an organization that has come to that position with no contribution of people of color, and now all of a sudden, and I would use coarser language if I wasn't in the setting, is extremely unfair. You need to go back and start asking yourself, how is your organization operating with respect to equity? What's your message around equity and fairness in your public statements? What does your staff look like? What's your commitment to it? How is it embedded in your work? There are ways of assessing what you're doing around equity, because it's likely that you need a much broader plan than just, I'm going to go out and hire a person of color or a woman or any specific identity group, and that's going to help solve the problem. So That I think is the most important. And let me, while I'm saying it, because I saw a couple of questions about hard tools. That's a really hard tool. There are a bunch of those equity assessment tools. United Way has done a lot of work, and some other big national players, so you don't have to do it de novo. But starting with that org assessment, I think is really important. The second tool that I think is really important for people to think about in the equity work is these equity impact analysis tools that are fashioned after environmental impact assessment tools, where really after you've made a decision, preferably before you've made a decision, to really stop and think about what are the likely impacts of that decision or that policy or whatever it is on different subpopulations. Their other tool, and that is similar to that, but a little different because I think it has great value propositions behind it, is targeted universalism model from John Powell. And there's a really good quick video, 3 or 4 minutes, that explain the basic. His institute has some other tools. So what I'm saying is those are all tools to help you get situated to do the work right, because you need to understand what's happening in the organization. And while I know the inclination might be that we're too white right now and we need to immediately deal with, with a little complexion diversity in our staffing, it might be a bad idea to start there without an underlying understanding of the organization that puts that decision in some context. Otherwise, it may seem to your staff and to others that it's out of the blue, as opposed to coming through a process where people are learning about the organization and how they're addressing issues of equity. And I think on all 3 of those sort of tools, there are some link. I think on the CIF site, there are some links to some of those tools. If not, we'll send them out in the materials, some links to bibliographies and other things for those tools.
Terrific, Junious. Thank you. I was going to ask for tools to close. You are one step ahead. I really appreciate that. So I think that is going to be our last question and contribution from Junious and Sheri for today. Thank you both so much. As always, I learned so much listening, and I see lots of thank yous coming in the chat, and gratitude for your time today. So thank you all. And I apologize to those who we did not get to your questions, but I trust everyone was able to take some really valuable learning from today's session. So just in closing, I would like to invite folks who enjoyed today's session to continue learning with us at our Collective Impact Action Summit, which is in 2 weeks. Amazing speaker lineup. This just as the tip of the iceberg here with our keynote sessions, but we have over 25 sessions lined up for you to learn from, not only folks that are kind of big name speakers, but also other practitioners and colleagues in the field sharing about their experiences, case studies, and lessons from their work. So we really invite you to join us in 2 weeks for the Collective Impact Action Summit. In addition, if you enjoyed today's session, just want to make sure folks know we have a podcast. You can subscribe on your favorite podcast platform, any of the ones listed here. And we have a range of sessions. Some are more how-to oriented, others are recordings of past keynotes and kind of thought leader type talks. So check it out if you thought today's session was helpful in your work. So with that, I want to again thank you, Sheri and Junious. Also, thank you, Tracy, who is running things behind the scenes seamlessly as always. So thank you so much, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks.